Los Angeles, the sprawling megalopolis often romanticized in film, is now the stage for a daily, exhausting battle, the sidewalk standoff. This is a physical flashpoint of the homelessness crisis, where the needs of the city's massive unhoused population directly clash with the infrastructure and expectations of housed residents and businesses. The city's current count reports approximately 146,260 homeless individuals within the city of Los Angeles alone, reflecting a 10% rise from 2023, and the vast majority of these individuals are unsheltered, pushing them onto the sidewalks, underpasses, and parks. This overcrowding of public space fuels the tension. The city has attempted to manage this friction through ordinances like LA Municipal Code 41.18, which designates specific sensitive zones where camping is illegal. However, an analysis of these clear-outs shows that 81% of encampments had people return who had been there before the operation. This statistic reveals the brutal futility of the current strategy. Without housing, the unhoused have no place to go, transforming sidewalks into contested territory where human beings and their few possessions are in perpetual conflict with pedestrian traffic and local expectations. The daily standoffs over the right to exist in public space are a visible manifestation of a system that has failed to provide a fundamental alternative. Property rights versus human rights. Where does the line end? The conflict over public space in Los Angeles is fundamentally a legal and ethical battle over the definition of public itself, specifically pitting property rights against human rights. For the housed, the ability to safely and cleanly access public spaces, as well as the right to secure the area surrounding their private property, is paramount. For the unhoused, the right to exist, rest, and shelter oneself from the elements is a basic human necessity, often defended as a constitutional right, particularly when no shelter is available. This tension crystallized around LA's notorious Municipal Code 41.18, which severely restricts where unhoused people can sit, lie, or sleep. While proponents argue that 41.18 is necessary to restore order to neighborhoods, critics call it the criminalization of poverty, noting that it fails to offer a viable alternative to the streets. The central judicial precedent, the Martin v. Boise ruling, established that cities cannot legally prohibit sleeping outside if they lack sufficient available shelter beds. LA has attempted to circumnavigate this by designating specific no-sit/no-lie zones, yet the underlying reality persists. As long as the city has a massive deficit in accessible housing, enforcing these laws forces citizens into an impossible choice: break the law or freeze on the pavement. This legal tightrope walk ensures that the debate over LA's public spaces remains rooted in a zero-sum calculation: the property rights of the many versus the survival rights of the F. EW. Vehicular vexation, the RV and car encampment wars. The housing crisis has birthed a unique form of LA friction, the vehicular vexation, or the war over vehicle encampments. Faced with impossible rents, thousands of Angelenos have converted their cars, vans, or RVs into permanent homes. The 2025 count included approximately 13,000 people living in vehicles across the county, making up a sizable and often overlooked segment of the unhoused population. The friction arises from the clash between vehicle residents, who rely on public streets for their survival, and housed residents who cite concerns over safety, blight, and sanitation. Municipal parking laws, designed for short-term parking, are ill-suited for permanent residency, leading to a constant game of cat and mouse. Cities have attempted solutions through safe parking programs, which provide secure lots and basic services, but the capacity is woefully inadequate, falling short of the total need by thousands of spaces. Simultaneously, the city continues to enforce anti-oversized vehicle ordinances, essentially pushing RVs and vans into perpetual motion. This approach merely displaces a problem from one neighborhood to the next, cementing the belief among vehicle dwellers that they are unwanted and hunted, while confirming the frustration of residents who see their streets overrun by unregulated mobile. Housing, the business exodus. How street crisis kills LA. Commerce. The omnipresent street crisis has evolved from a humanitarian issue into a critical threat to LA's economic health, sparking a business exodus in several high-friction areas. Small business owners, particularly those in downtown, Hollywood, and Venice, report a significant deterioration of their operating environment. The challenges range from increased shoplifting and vandalism to the constant need for private security, driving up operational costs. More fundamentally, many businesses cite a pronounced drop in customer traffic, with consumers avoiding areas where encampments, aggressive panhandling, and public drug use are prevalent. Surveyed data from local business associations in 2025 indicated that over 60% of small business owners felt the homelessness crisis was the biggest factor negatively affecting their profitability. This sustained economic pressure forces businesses to relocate or, in worst-case scenarios, close permanently, creating vacant storefronts that only exacerbate the sense of urban decay and further concentrate street activity. The cost is twofold: the loss of local tax revenue for city and the removal of the very commercial vitality that makes a neighborhood desirable and safe for everyone. The street crisis isn't just about social services. It's about the very economic viability of LA's core commerce. Ill districts. The cost of chaos, LA's billion-dollar cleanup bill. The attempt to manage the friction in public spaces comes with an enormous fiscal price tag, leading to LA's billion-dollar cleanup bill. In the 2024 to 2025 fiscal year, the city of Los Angeles dedicated approximately $950 million to address homelessness, a figure that includes housing, services, and the cost of maintaining public order and sanitation. A significant but often hidden portion of this budget is allocated not to housing people, but to managing the chaos of street living. This includes costs to the Department of Sanitation and Public Works to conduct frequent encampment cleanups, which involve specialized biohazard teams, waste removal, and equipment. The LAPD's involvement in nonviolent, service-related calls also siphons millions from their core policing budget. The problem with this expenditure is that it constitutes a revolving door of maintenance, not a sustainable solution. The RAND Corporation reported in a recent study that the cost of managing an unhoused individual's crisis, through emergency room visits, jail stays, and cleanups, is exponentially higher than the cost of providing permanent supportive housing. The constant and escalating cleanup bill is the clearest indicator that the city is spending money to manage a crisis rather than solve it by investing in long-term, structural housing solutions. Inside Safe. Is Mayor Bass's program a breakthrough or a Band-Aid? Mayor Karen Bass's signature program, Inside Safe, launched with the explicit goal of bringing people indoors from their tents and makeshift encampments and de-escalating the public space conflict. Inside Safe is an encampment resolution program that offers immediate temporary shelter, often motel rooms, followed by supportive services and a pathway to permanent housing. The program represents a significant pivot, operating with an FY 2024 to 2025 budget allocation of approximately $185 million in the City of Los Angeles budget. Proponents point to tangible results. Since its inception, the program has placed over 4,700 people into interim housing and has made a visible impact by clearing major encampments in key areas, leading to a drop in the unsheltered population in the city by 7.9% in 2025. Critics, however, argue that Inside Safe is ultimately a Band-Aid if it fails to deliver on the second most critical promise, permanent housing. They cite the slow pace of transitioning people from expensive motel rooms to subsidized apartments, fearing that the program merely swaps one form of interim living for another, extremely costly one, without building the permanent housing stock LA desperately needs to make the solution stick. The long-term success of Inside Safe hinges entirely on the city's ability to create an adequate inventory of stable, affordable homes. The missing middle, the failure of low-barrier shelter. A critical gap in LA's strategy to de-escalate the street friction is the missing middle, the widespread failure to provide sufficient low-barrier, accessible emergency shelter. Traditional shelters often have high barriers, strict sobriety requirements, curfews, mandatory religious services, or a ban on partners or pets that make them inaccessible to the vast majority of people living on the street. The unsheltered population, Many dealing with addiction, mental health issues, or who simply cannot bear to be separated from a companion animal frequently refuse traditional shelter beds. This contributes to a paradox where shelter beds are available, yet encampments persist. Data consistently shows that low-barrier solutions, such as tiny home villages or purpose-built A-bridge home shelters with private or semi-private spaces and fewer rules, have significantly higher acceptance rates. However, the available supply of these effective, low-barrier options remains dwarfed by the need. The absence of this missing middle means that the only options offered to many unhoused residents are either an unsuitable traditional shelter or the street. This failure of inventory directly contributes to the visible persistence of encampments, thereby ensuring the daily friction with housed residents continues. Baited. Police, security, and survival. The LAPD's impossible task. The Los Angeles Police Department, LAPD, has been pushed into the role of de facto frontline responders for the homelessness crisis, an impossible task that stretches its resources and fuels a cycle of friction. Housed residents overwhelmingly rely on the LAPD to enforce quality of life ordinances, respond to mental health crises, and manage encampments. As a result, the LAPD spends a significant portion of its time responding to nonviolent, service-related calls involving the unhoused population, diverting millions of dollars and thousands of officer hours away from conventional policing. This enforcement often centers on the controversial Municipal Code 41.18, leading to a high number of minor citations and arrests for offenses like public camping or illegal dumping. This approach, widely criticized as a criminalization of poverty, does little to solve the root problems and instead creates criminal records that make securing housing and employment even more difficult for the unhoused. The friction intensifies when law enforcement is involved in encampment sweeps. While the city argues that sweeps are necessary for sanitation and public safety, they result in the destruction of personal property and severe trauma for the unhoused, eroding trust in city services. Many advocates argue that the resources spent on enforcement will be better redirected to specialized, non-police care teams, crisis and resiliency teams, composed of mental health professionals and outreach workers. The continued reliance on the police to solve the social and housing crisis fundamentally misunderstands the nature of the problem, trapping the LAPD in a reactive, perpetually failing role and making the encounter between enforcement and survival a daily, high-stakes event. The system has failed to provide the necessary supportive infrastructure, leaving law enforcement to manage the tragic symptoms on T. He's street. Beyond blame, how LA must reclaim public space for everyone. Moving beyond blame and the cycle of friction requires Los Angeles to adopt a comprehensive, human-centered strategy focused on reclaiming public space through inclusion, not exclusion. The current model, defined by costly cleanups, punitive ordinances, and inadequate shelter, has demonstrably failed to create safe, usable public spaces for anyone. The true path forward lies in a massive, coordinated scale-up of three critical interventions. First, the city must aggressively fund and streamline the creation of permanent supportive housing, PSH, which provides subsidized housing paired with on-site services like mental health care and addiction treatment. Studies have shown that PSH is not only the most effective long-term solution, but is also cost-neutral or even cost-saving when compared to the ongoing expense of crisis services. The goal must shift from simply counting beds to building enough PSH units to meet the chronic need. Second, LA must invest in low-barrier navigation centers and tiny home villages as the true missing middle. These sites must be immediately accessible, allowing pets and couples, and prioritizing getting people off the street with minimal friction. This approach immediately reduces the visibility of encampments and creates secure locations for service providers to engage the population. Finally, public spaces must be actively managed by non-law enforcement teams. The implementation of widespread, civilian-led care teams for mental health calls and dedicated sanitation teams for public hygiene would shift the responsibility away from the LAPD. This not only saves resources but establishes a relationship of trust with the unhoused population, encouraging them to accept services rather than flee. Reclaiming public space is not achieved by pushing one group out, but by building a functional, humane safety net that ensures that the sidewalk, the park, and the street are usable, clean, and safe because every resident, housed and unhoused, has a place to be. Only through the structural change can LA transform its daily battlefield into a shared civic space.